Feature number 24 is curves, and curves is the preeminent luminance adjustment feature inside of Photoshop. That is to say, it is the most powerful feature of them all where luminance adjustment is concerned inside of Photoshop proper. You might argue that you have even better control inside of Camera Raw, but where Photoshop is concerned, this is as good as it gets. And what you can do is you can adjust your luminance, that is your highlights, your shadows, your midtones, and so forth. You can adjust the brightness of the image on a level-by-level basis. So you have quarter tone control and three-quarter tone control and so on. And you don't have to know what any of that means because you're just editing points inside of a graph. Now, it does demand a pound of flesh. It is one of the harder functions to use inside of Photoshop, but my goodness, is it capable. As always, I'm working in an image from the image vendor Fotolia, and it comes from photographer Mike Watson. So some of the images end up costing more. If you're willing to invest in a classic stock photography image, then you can, and they are available there. And sometimes you get what you pay for. In other words, in this case, this is a beautiful image of this model set up against a snowy background. My goodness, is she shivering. Now, here's the thing, though. I'm not that keen on the degree to which this is a high-key image. In other words, it's quite blown out. And you might argue, well, that's good because we have a snowy background. We want to impart the frosty mood. But I figured this image could have a lot more heft to it if we deepen some of the highlights and the midtones, and that's what we're about to do. Now, I'm working inside of Photoshop CS4. If you're working inside of Photoshop CS3 or earlier, then things will work a little different, and I'll try to keep you apprised of the differences here. For starters, if you're going to apply a curves adjustment layer, you would go down to the black-white icon and choose curves. That works across all the versions of the software. However, since I'm working inside of Photoshop CS4, I'll go up to the Adjustments palette, and I will Alt-click or Option-click on the third icon in the first row right there, which is Curves. And the advantage of Alt-clicking or on the Mac Option-clicking is that I can name the layer as I create it. So I'll go ahead and call it Heft, because that's what I'm trying to add to this image. And I'll click OK. And now we get the big old Curves interface here inside the Adjustments palette. Now, when I say big old, I mean, by default, it's small. Actually, it looks like this. I'll go ahead and click on this icon here in order to reduce the size of this curves graph right there. That's no good. You want a big curves graph because right now we're seeing a graph of indeterminate width and height. I don't know how many pixels are involved here. But what you want is 256 pixels wide and 256 pixels tall because that gives you control over every point inside of your standard 8-bit per channel image, and that's the metaphor that Curves uses. So, in order to get the big graph, which you'll need, you click on this little folder icon with the arrow in it. Again, this is only inside of Photoshop CS4. You don't have to worry about it in older versions. You'll be working inside of a dialog box that's already properly sized. All right, so we're working inside of an RGB image, as presumably you will be inside of Photoshop most of the time. Every once in a while, you work in CMYK or some other color mode. But right now, I'm working inside of an RGB image. And by default, when you're working with RGB, you will see, here's a graph of all the luminance levels inside the image, ranging from black, over here on the left, to white, all the way on the right-hand side of the graph. And we're also seeing, and everything in between is in between. So black's over here, white's over here. And we have this histogram that's showing us the balance of power where the luminance levels are concerned inside of this image. So we don't have much in the way of shadows. The shadows are going to be over here on the dark side of the graph, the left side. The highlights are going to be over here on the right-hand side. There are a lot of highlights inside the image. No surprise because it's so very bright. And then we have a fair amount of midtones in between in this central portion of the graph. And that's what we're seeing. This is a bar graph of all the luminance levels inside the image. This is what we're seeing inside the graph. Now, if you want to change the balance of the image, then what you do is you click somewhere along this curve. Now, I know it looks like a straight line. That's the way it starts. But it wants to be a curve. And you curve it by clicking someplace inside the line. And I typically, when in doubt, just click right there in the middle. And I'll click to set a point there, and that's going to be a midtone point. And then if I want to lighten my midtones, I drag upward because we're basically mapping the luminance levels. We're mapping the existing ones that are measured horizontally with the presumed ones, with the ones we're looking for, which are measured vertically, starting with black at the bottom and going up to white at the top. So in my case, I'm saying what was a medium gray, essentially, an absolute midtone, I want it to become much brighter. That's why I'm dragging it upward. And I'm making all the colors inside the image brighter as well, depending on how close they are to either being black or white. And you can see that black and white remain fixed so that I'm not clipping any colors inside my image. Now, this is not the effect that I want. So what I would do instead is I would go ahead and drag that guy down in order to darken it up. Again, I'm mostly affecting the midtones, but I'm affecting the shadows and the highlights to an extent as well. Now, if I want to gain independent control over the shadows and the highlights, then I would create additional points. For example, I'll go ahead and click on a point here inside of the highlight region. Adding a point doesn't do anything. It just gives you a significant point that you can then modify here inside the palette. And now I'll go ahead and drag it down in order to darken up the highlights independently of the midtones and the shadows. Notice that the shadows are actually growing lighter at this point because this midtone point is serving as a fulcrum. So as I drag that highlight point up, the shadows sink a little bit. As I drag that highlight point down, the shadows raise a little bit. If I want to raise them a little bit more, I could click to set a point, and then I could adjust it as well. And you can adjust these points from the keyboard. So just press an arrow key in order to move. If I press the right arrow key, I'm going to move the point to the right, and the left arrow key is going to move it to the left. And why that's significant, that's obvious. I know you know your right and your left there, or at least most of you do, presumably. Why that's significant is the left and right arrows are changing the input value, that is the luminance level that you're mapping in the first place. And then the up and down arrow, so the up arrow key is going to move the point up, the down arrow key is going to move the point down. That's changing the output value here, that is the luminance level to which you are mapping this existing luminance level inside the image. So the degree to which you are changing the shadows in my case. All right, so that's one way to work. I'm going to clear all that stuff because I want to show you a few other things you can do. And I'll clear it out by clicking on this Reset to Adjustment Default button, which doesn't exist inside CS3 and earlier. What you would do inside CS3 and earlier is you would press the Alt key or the Option key on the Mac, and you would click on what was formerly the Cancel button. It's now the Reset button. So weird, but that's the way it works. Anyway, I'll just click on this button here in order to clear things out. And the reason I'm clearing things is because I want you to see that there's some other tricks that are available to you. Now, there's all kinds of micro tricks. For example, if you're working inside of CS3 or you're working inside the dialog box in CS4, you can move your cursor outside the dialog box. It'll change to a little eyedropper, and then you can drag inside the image to see a bouncing ball move inside the graph. Now, it's confusing for a lot of folks. What in the world has happened to that bouncing ball inside of CS4? You can get to it either by going to the standard eyedropper tool, and then you have to press and hold the Control key or the Command key on the Mac, and then you can drag around and you'll see the bouncing ball. Do you see it up there in the highlight region in the upper corner of the Adjustments palette graph right there? And that's because I have the Control key down or the Command key down on the Mac. Now, that's just a bizarre trick, in my opinion, especially because as soon as you release, you're going to add a point at that position. And that's an old school thing. That works inside CS3 as well. If you Control click or Command click, you're going to add a point at which you click to the composite graph. All right, I'll undo that modification just by pressing Control Z or Command Z on the Mac. The other thing you can do here inside CS4, because you can't just move your cursor out here unless some special tool is selected, and the eyedropper isn't really the most flexible solution here. The better thing to do is to grab this new target adjustment tool. This is the third time we've seen it now. We saw it for black and white when we looked at feature number 36. And when we looked at feature number, I forget what, but it was hue saturation, it had target adjustment as well inside CS4 and later. And so does Curves. Curves is the other adjustment feature that has this tool available to it. Go ahead and click on it. And then you can see if you just move the cursor around, I'm not dragging, I'm just moving, I get the bouncing ball. So I can see the bouncing ball there inside the graph. Now, what's really great about this tool is now I can just click and drag to change a color inside the image, to change a luminance level. And notice my little tool cursor is showing me that I drag up and down. So its physical appearance is always giving you a clue to how it works. So I'm going to go ahead and drag, for example, inside of her shoulder. And notice that sets a point. Look over there on the right-hand side of the screen. I can't point to it for you. I'm actually pointing in space right now, but you can't see me. But over there on the right-hand side of the graph, you can see that I've created an anchor point there. And now if I drag down, I'm going to move it down. I'm just dragging down inside the image over here on her shoulder. And then if I drag it up, I'm going to move that point up as well. So I can actually just drag points inside of the image. And this changes curves. In my opinion, this one tool takes what was formerly a very complicated command, takes a while to wrap your brain around how it works, and turns it in to a puppy dog. It is so easy to use because all you have to do is grab this tool and then start dragging around inside the image. So I might say, you know, this little sort of grayish area, that wants to be darker. So I'll click and drag inside of there, and I'll drag downward like so. And that does darken things up. And then if I decide, you know what, I want to adjust this point a little bit, I'll drag it down and to the left a little, because I'm modifying both the input and the output levels. And then you could drag someplace else, like in some sort of shadow detail that you want to raise. Maybe you want her eyelashes to be just slightly brighter or something along those lines. Anyway, I'm going to drag these around quite a bit in order to add that heft that I was telling you about that I think is so necessary to the success of this image. And I think this looks a fair amount better here. Now, just to give you a sense, this is the before version of the image, which now by comparison looks totally, ridiculously, obscenely blown out by comparison to my corrected version of the image. However, one of the problems is, and you'll run into this with curves, if you try to make these sorts of radical adjustments, and you do have this amazing level of control, you can drag these points willy-nilly. I mean, you can do this number right here if you want to, so that you apply a fairly preposterous correction to the image, if you so desire. And this is frequently, you'll hear these kinds of curve adjustments called arbitrary maps, because we are arbitrarily mapping the colors inside the image. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and drag these points to more logical positions, I think. Now, notice how gray things are getting out here inside the central image window, and that's because we have flattening occurring in the curve. So a slope in the curve is a good thing. Anytime we start flattening things out, we're going to see grays out here inside the image window. And the reason is because we're taking what were formerly a bunch of different luminance levels and changing them to either the same luminance levels or very close neighbors. And so we're going to lose a lot of color definition. We're also going to lose a lot of just general definition inside the image. So that's not what I want. I'll go ahead and move things over just a little bit like so. I'm liking this a lot better. But we still have a flat region right here. And if that's bothering you, if you're starting to see grays inside the image, and you should be bothered by that, frankly, then go down to your layers palette, assuming that you're working, and this works inside the Photoshop CS4, CS3, CS2, what have you. As long as you're working with an adjustment layer, drop down to the layers palette and change the blend mode from normal to luminosity. And that way you're not affecting the colors, you're just affecting the luminance information, and you're leaving the color balance the same way it was before. And as a result, we're ending up getting some sort of chap details inside of her skin. It looks totally wonderful. And we have a little bit of posterization. That's because we've applied a big, huge curve adjustment at this point. But it looks a lot better, in my estimation, than normal did. There's normal, which is something of a low color image. We're starting to lose a lot of color definition there. Anyway, I'm going to go ahead and switch it to luminosity. And I'm going to go ahead and back off this adjustment right there, that midtone adjustment. And I might take my shadows down just a little bit because we could stand to sync those shadows. Now, based on that, I think I'll take down my midtones as well. And I might even get a little more adventurous with my highlights. Not too much. I don't want to start crimping the graph. If you end up getting kinks in your graph, you'll end up getting bad results out there in the larger image window. But something along the lines of this right here is starting to look pretty good for me. And then the true benefit of working with something like an adjustment layer is that in addition to modifying the points on the graph, you could also just change the opacity. So if you feel like you've gone too far with your adjustments, and let's say I have my marquee tool active, then I could just press, let's say, 7 for 70% opacity here inside the layers palette in order to evoke the modification that you see before you now. And so, just to give you a sense of what we've been able to achieve here in a very short amount of time, just by dragging a few points around, albeit somewhat adventurously, here inside the adjustments palette, we've managed to achieve this effect right here. This is the before version of the image, quite bright, and this is the after version, a little bit more heft, thanks to the tried and true power of feature number 24, curves, here inside Photoshop.